Talk of it is everywhere at the moment. I'm referring to the dangers lurking online for all of us, but especially children and younger people. We're returning to a topic we've featured regularly on Late Lunch, this time with a woman who works with the young, mature and more senior among us across a range of issues that affect all of our lives. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show, among other things, mind, confidence and stress management coach Elfreda Manahan Vaughan. Elfreda, it's really good to see you again.
Thanks very much, Gerry.
Thank you for joining me. I'm delighted to, because you see, let me tell you that Elfreda was in touch with me and said, would you be interested in talking about a topic? And I'll tell you what she said, the exact words: building resilience in the world of social media. And of course, it's everywhere at the moment. Can I ask you this first, Elfreda? Is it different in the world of social media, this resilience, to the resilience we need in our daily lives?
I think, Gerry, it's the resilience you have in your daily life that makes the difference to the resilience you have in social media. And I think at the moment there's an awful lot of discussions about protecting ourselves online, you know, being aware of the safety issues and all of the technological issues, which I know you've discussed with other guests. But I think it's really about the person, because for all the people that are on social media, it is a small percentage that is vulnerable. And so the vulnerability that appears in social media is a vulnerability that appears in their life. And I think if we address the problems that young people have and adults have in their broader life, that changes the way they behave online.
You see, when I was a young fella, let me give you an analogy. Many moons ago, there was no social media, there was no online. We were talking a moment ago, there was one phone box at the corner of the street.
Sure.
That was the nearest we had to communication with anybody. But you know what you learned when you were a young person? You learn to run fast from trouble. And you learn to make friends with a bigger bully than the bully that was bullying you. You know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, Gerry, I remember when I was young, there were certain places my parents said don't go. There were certain people my parents said don't talk to them. That there was always this idea that there's certain places that you're a little bit more vulnerable than others. Now, online, obviously, it's a much bigger spectrum and there are more and more people that can access you and access your information. But the vulnerabilities that occur online are the vulnerabilities that are there in real life. So, you know, if you're somebody when you're online that you're oversharing information, if you're somebody that's, you know, engaging with conversations with strangers, you know, they're the things we tell children: don't talk to strangers on the street. And a child in most cases would not go up to an adult or a strange person and start a conversation. And those children probably don't online either. You know I've spoken to young people and they'd talk about maybe getting messages from people, or they'd get messages that would request, you know, explicit information. And they would say, oh, Frida, I just ignore them, or I block them and I delete them. And that's a lot of young people who will do that, because they'll have the sense to realise you don't share that kind of information. But a certain number of people, both adults and young people, are inclined to share like that. And I think if we have to address what's happening with them in their broader life, and that then creates a resilience when it comes to being online, because they're more sure of themselves. You know, the world at the moment is very much out there kind of a place. You know, everything is online. You share all your photos. Your whole personal life can be out there if you want. And so people don't experience a whole level of privacy. But that, online appearance has this level of perfection. And we're pushing people all the time to portray this perfect image. And then that makes us feel very vulnerable about failing and very vulnerable about being ourselves. And I think we've inadvertently created this problem where it's not okay to be ordinary. It's not okay to just be an average person. We have to be exceptional, because most of the people, and particularly young people, follow these people, are celebrities. They're the exception to the rule. The rule is, you know, the rest of us are just your average Joe Soap who has a job, has a family, and, you know, tries to be happy and makes the most out of life.
Is that what you mean by impression management online? Is that what you're saying to me there? That, you know, people create personas of themselves, and you have the rich and famous as well, but you have other people where others go on and say, oh, look what he or she is doing, look what they've got. I remember Ciara Burke saying to me, hearing a woman with opinions, her daughters on Christmas Day, they went online after they got their gifts and they said, oh my God, look what everybody else has got. You know, that impression that's given.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly, Gerry. And that's the thing, that some people give an impression of perfection. And that's not the reality. And so that influences a huge amount of people where we feel, oh, well, we have to portray this perfect image. But I think impression management is also about understanding about what you're putting out there, what's representing you. You know, I know on my social media, obviously I have my own page and then I have my own personal profile. Now, a lot of people that I meet through work will access my personal profile. So I'm very careful about what I share. I don't share, you know, pictures or images that I feel are not appropriate for a public forum, because as far as I'm concerned, it's all public. If I wouldn't walk down through the main street of the town I live in displaying that information on a sign for everybody to see, then I'm not putting it on social media. And if there are certain posts that people put up about things that I might have an opinion on, but I don't feel is appropriate for me to discuss in a public forum, then I don't comment. I don't like, I don't share. But people often overshare. You know, people often protect an image. People often portray themselves as something that they're not. And I think that's something we have to really be aware of, that it is a false environment. And so you have to kind of think about, well, who am I online? You know, do I want to be a genuine, sincere, authentic person online? Do I want to portray, you know, an image that isn't real? For me, it's an authentic image, but it also has a level of privacy, because there are some things that are not meant to be in a public forum.
Streetwise.
Yeah, sure. It is a bit like that. Yeah, exactly. It's about, you know, thinking, well, okay, is it okay? And you see a lot of discussions where you'll see people put, you know, very personal opinions, and then they get, you know, the negative comments. And if you're somebody who's vulnerable, that's where the real risk, you know, comes in. If you're putting stuff out there, you're exposing yourself in an online place, thinking that you're safe, and then somebody says something negative. If you're already vulnerable, if you don't have the resilience to go, you know what, I don't care what they think, then you're going to be in trouble. That's when we're open to the trolling, to the cyberbullying, and all of the other stuff that happens for a certain number of people online.
Sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Another throwback to a different era. But really, you need to approach this with that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to, I train people in mindfulness, and one of the things in mindfulness they talk about is non-attachment. And so non-attachment is where you're not attached to a particular outcome, but you're also not attached to an idea of who you are. And I think one of the biggest things people would struggle with is they have this idea of, I am this person, or I'm meant to be this person. And if you're living up to a certain identity or a certain label, then messing up or failing or doing something that doesn't fit with that, you know, is really difficult for you. And for a lot of teenagers, that's a huge problem. You know, if they're expected to be the model student, expected to be very well behaved, and then they make a mistake, very often the last place they will go to is their parents to say, listen, this is after happening to me online, because they think they're going to get in trouble, or they think that they're going to, you know, be reprimanded in some way. And I think that's something as parents, people need to be really aware of how they actually discuss things and what they say to their children. You know, there's a particular way of communicating where they talk about, you know, criticism, or they talk about compliments. And so you have, you know, an active constructive comment. And an active constructive comment is where your child comes home and says they got an A, and you say, that's amazing. What subject was it in? You know, what did the teacher say? What questions did you answer? And it's an active response. Now, if you're passively constructive, you'll just say, that's nice. But if you're actively destructive, when they come in, you'll say, oh my God, I'm amazed. You actually got an A. That's amazing. I doubt you'll get another one this year. You know, you must have just kind of pulled it off that time. And people do that all the time and they don't realise. And then the passive destructive is where you don't say anything at all. And so if you have a child that lives in an environment that is very critical, that's constantly being pointed out their faults, then it's quite possible they will turn to an online place to find somebody who will be reassuring and who will say positive comments to them. That may not be genuine. And if something then happens within that environment, they're not going to go to the place where they get criticised to talk to their parents and say, I'm in trouble. Or their teacher, or whoever it might be, whatever adult might have an influence in their life.
It's a very, very good point. I'm just going to head to a short break, but before I do, in summary, be careful what you post and be wary of what you post. Be careful of the conversations you join into and give an opinion on as well. Absolutely. These are messages you want to get across today, those two in particular.
Yeah, very much so. And also about how we approach ourselves before we ever go online.
Yes.
Who we are outside of that.
Yes, and that comes back to what we were talking about there, the impression management. You know, what impression
Absolutely.
you give, and then be aware of the impression that others are giving back to you as well. By God, there's an awful lot to think about in this, isn't there? Elfreda Elfreda, let's talk for a moment about children and teenagers in particular, and the moods they experience. And if you're a parent or a guardian or someone who's with them, and you'll obviously get the vibe when it's positive, and you will understand when they're feeling a bit down as well. Can social media and that interaction in there drive that? And when you spot these, how do you foster one and try and lift them from the negativity, the pessimism?
Yeah, I think social media has a huge influence on that. As I said earlier, it's about that level of perfection. And I think if you're having a negative experience on social media, it's going to influence your mood. There's amazing work by a gentleman called Martin Seligman, who is the father of positive psychology. And he's done extensive research into depression and into, happiness. And one thing he's discovered is that he calls it the explanatory style, which is the way that we talk to ourselves and talk to our other people, demonstrate whether we are optimistic or pessimistic. And if we're pessimistic, we're prone to depression. Now, there are 3 different forms of depression. You have the bipolar depression, which needs to be treated with medication. You have unipolar, which is the opposite of that, but is when it's more severe. But then you have general depression. Every single person on the planet has that. It comes in waves. You could have it for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, a month. If it's months, if it's 6 months, then you're in trouble, and that's where you need to go and get help. But for most of us, if we didn't feel depressed after we lost a loved one, or we got rejected by a boyfriend or a girlfriend, we wouldn't be human. So it's normal for us to experience that. But what happens is people often experience something called learned helplessness, where they don't feel they have any control over what's happening in their life. And that creates this pessimistic language style. And so Martin Seligman says there's 3 things that you can notice. Do they make things personal? Is it permanent? And is it pervasive? And so an example of that is, your child comes home and they say they failed in their maths test. And suddenly they're saying, I'm no good at maths. So it's now personal. And so then they'll say, I'll never be able to do anything. That's pervasive, and it's also permanent, because they've used a word which is a universal quantifier. That's what we call them in NLP, which is never. And so that's very pessimistic language, because it means that they're kind of helpless. I can't change it. It's about me, and it's going to impact everything in my life because it's never going to change, and I can do nothing about it. And that type of helplessness actually causes us a huge amount of problems. And so there are techniques that you can use. In NLP, we use something called the Metta model, where you ask specific questions to break down a belief that somebody has about themselves or what's happening to them. Martin Seligman has a very simple technique called the ABCDE technique. So A is the adverse situation. That's fail the maths test. B is I'm no good at maths. That's a belief. The consequences is the C. That's I'll never be able to do anything, or I'll never be any good at maths. D is where you dispute it. So what's your evidence? Did you just fail every single maths test, or have you just failed one? Is there an other alternative? Is it you had a bad day? Is it that you didn't actually study for the test? Is it that you hadn't actually covered all those topics in class and you were asked something new? Is it that it's a particular type of maths that you need a bit more help with? So all of those things dispute that. And when we start to see that there are other options, other alternatives to what we originally believed, we feel more energized to make a change. And that's where you empower somebody. And so if your child, if you notice they have this pessimistic type language, this pessimistic explanatory style, you need to challenge those beliefs, by getting them to prove it or dispute it. And the other thing is you need to get them to be empowered. And there's a technique called the if-then. And so if a child says something's happening, or a teenager, you say, okay, if that happens, then what will you do? And the more thens we have, the more, then I'll do this, or then I'll do this, the more in control we feel. We feel, we have power over this. And it may simply be that you have power over your own mood or your own thinking, but there is always a level of control in every situation. And if you push your child or yourself to find that, you'll shift into more optimistic thinking. And when we're optimistic, everything is transient. So, it's things, the maths test, you go, I was having a bad day, Asher, the next time I'll do a bit better. And those things are much more optimistic. Just because I failed one test doesn't mean everything is ruined. You never know what could happen. That's what the optimism, and when he's done his experiments, he's done a lot of experiments. 3 in 10 people are naturally optimistic, but the other 7 are prone to pessimism. And pessimism can be useful because it can make us very clear. And so he says you need flexible optimism. If you're going to approach something that might be dangerous, you need a little bit of pessimism to give you that bit of reality and a bit of clarity. But in general, optimism is what keeps us going. And an optimistic style makes you happy. When you start to pay attention to people, you'll really hear it.
Do parents need to intervene, as you've just said there? Do they need that skill set to be able to recognise and become involved? And you know yourself as well with teenagers, they can be quite distanced. You know, they'll think when they're children they love you and you're their God, and suddenly they go through these years, which funny enough are the years when they're going more online and they're, susceptible to this.
Absolutely. Well, I think, that we need to engage with teenagers more. And I know recently, you may have come across it on Twitter, somebody had done research with children and teenagers in palliative care and asked them about their lives. And not one of them mentioned social media as being important. What they did mention was spending time with their family, spending time with their parents, with their siblings. And I think we're so quick to kind of all go on the phones, into the different rooms or switch the television on and be passive. That if you start a situation where even if it's only once a week, the family are together and you have a chance to talk about things, you have a chance to play some games. A really nice thing to do, which pushes optimism, is to talk about gratitude. At the end of the day, around the dinner table, if you're having dinner together, or, pop into their room before you say goodnight to them and say, tell me 2 or 3 things you're grateful for today, and ask them why they happened, because that pushes them into thinking about what level of control they had over the things that are good in their life, So if they say, oh, well, I'm grateful I did well in the maths test, you say, well, why did that happen? Oh, well, because I studied. Suddenly they're in control. And so gratitude really makes us feel very, very hopeful. And it's a really useful thing, very simple for parents to do. And if a child is more grateful, then they're more optimistic. And also at even the start of the day, around the breakfast table, what kind of day are you planning on having today? What things are you looking forward to? What good things are going to happen? What things are you in control of? Even those simple conversations can make a difference. And if you're at home going, oh, that'll never work with my family, well, that's your pessimistic explanatory style, and you need to watch that with yourself, because remember, how we talk is often how our children talk, especially young children. And so it's very important that we're aware of what we're projecting into our own environment. So you go for the optimism, and that will make a difference with your children too.
Before we finish up, the big conundrum is, you say that children who are facing critical life situations don't pay any heed to this. They don't rate it, a social media presence, whatever. But the fact is that it's here and it's huge and it's growing, and children are getting younger and they're spending more time on it. Right when you're in a critical situation in your life, things become different for you. How do you try and, say this is only, what would you say, something that's good in life and very positive, can be very positive as well, but let's put it in perspective. How do you get that message across? Drop the phone, go do something else, talk to us, engage. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, well, I think what's really important is that, young people and all of us have lives outside our social media. I know Martin Seligman has an acronym called PERMA, which is what creates well-being. So one is positive emotions. So that's doing the things that make us happy. One is engagement, to be engaged in an activity. And obviously you don't get a huge amount of engagement for social media. It's very passive. Relationships is the other. So making sure you have time with people you love. Meaning in your life. We don't get a lot of meaning from social media. We do get meaning from doing things that are worthwhile. And the last one is accomplishment, which is trying to achieve things. So encouraging your children and yourself to have broader interests, to engage with other things in your life, then puts social media in its perspective, puts it where it is, that it's incredible, it's useful, it's enjoyable in so many ways, but it isn't the be all and end all, and that's what's so important.
We'll leave it there for today. If people want to find out more or get in touch with you, how?
Well, you can find me if you Google Elfreda Manahan Vaughan. My website is Metta-morphics.com. You'll also find me on Facebook, and you'll find me on Twitter under Metta-morphics as well, and you'll find everything about me there.
Elfreda, it's been great to meet you again today in the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much, Gerry.
The Late Lunch with Blackstone Motors Drogheda, home of the Super Sales Team.